Over the course of James Sunderland's somber trek through the town of Silent Hill, Maine, he encounters a number of gnarled and twisted aberrations that roam its desolate streets. But just what are these horrifying creatures? Why are they here? And just what do they represent? Clutch tight your seal of Metatron, because we're about to find out. Welcome to my synopsis on the enemies of Silent Hill 2. Let's start with a closer look at the lying figure, seeing as how it's the first enemy James encounters after he arrives in Silent Hill. This enemy is portrayed as a figure screaming in agony wrapped in what appears to be a straitjacket of flesh that features narrow feet in the shape of women's high-heeled shoes. The contorted face of the figure is likely a metaphorical reflection of Mary's pain caused by her illness, and also a reflection of James's mental torment. While the facial expression reflects the respective pain of both these characters, the straitjacket likely represents their individual states. For Mary, this would be in regards to being forced to remain bedridden, and for James, the mental struggle of his conscience to break free and relay the truth behind Mary's death. The last detail of the lying figure that stands out to me is the shape of its feet. With a distinct resemblance to a woman's high-heeled shoe, this likely represents Mary's longing to feel normal, attractive, and desirable again. The lying figure is pretty simplistic overall, and it only has two basic attacks, and it's really not all that dangerous. It can spray an acidic mist from its torso, which oftentimes you can just strafe, and its other attack is to quickly charge while it's crippled. If it's moving too fast and you can't quite pin it down, shoot it with your handgun to incapacitate it and use a stomp to finish it off. These little buggers sometimes hide under cars and prey on unsuspecting passers-by, so be cautious when moving around vehicles. Next on our list we have the Creeper, and no, I'm not talking about the Scooby-Doo villain. A mostly simplistic insect enemy that's little more than a nuisance. There's not too much to say about these little guys, save for that they're likely a manifestation of Alessa's entomophobia. For those of you with hippopotamonstrosus quipedaliophobia, I'll put it simply: the fear of insects. You can finish off the Creeper with a few pistol rounds, or the Silent Hill classic. Coming up next, we're going to be taking a look at the Mannequin. The Mannequin is a monster that is joined at its center by two pairs of female legs. This enemy likely reflects James's lustful thoughts and carnal desires due to his and Mary's forced celibacy. On the topic of Mary, the Mannequin appears to be dressed quite similarly. Seeing as how the Mannequin is without arms, its only means of defending itself are its legs. They also strike randomly whenever James approaches. This likely represents Mary's state of vulnerability and her inability to physically refuse James's sexual advances. Following the Mannequin, this spunky and mildly attractive lady is referred to as the Bubblehead Nurse. Or should I say, a Bubblehead Nurse, because these things are fucking everywhere, though you'll mostly encounter them as they stalk the dark halls of the Brookhaven Hospital. The most notable feature of the Bubblehead Nurse is what appears to be a synthetic bag of septic blood and pus that covers the entirety of their faces. As the Bubblehead Nurses move, they tend to twitch and erratically shake their heads, as they appear to suffocate, attributable to the contents of the bags they wear. In addition to the bags that cover their faces, the nurses wear a low-cut, fetishized version of a typical nurse's uniform. The sacks of putrid blood that the nurses wear are most likely to be symbolic of the nature of Mary's death by suffocation, whereas the sexualized outfits, open blouse, and low cut of the skirt likely reflect James's perverse mentality and sexual thoughts of Mary, which arose on account of what little time he spent visiting her at the hospital. The Bubblehead Nurses tend to violently react to either light or sound, and it's my personal recommendation to fight them at range. After a nurse is no longer fit for service, give her a good stomp to put the poor girl out of commission for good. Next up on our enemy index is the Flesh Lip. This beautiful girl, is portrayed as an amalgam of meat and flesh amongst random humanoid appendages, with lips towards the bottom that hang suspended from the ceiling in rusted metal cages. There honestly isn't too much to say about the flesh lip, so I'll try to keep this brief. The lattices that contain the flesh lip are likely indicative of Mary's confinement to her bed over the course of her hospitalization. According to Masahiro Ito, the lead artist and enemy designer for Silent Hills 2 and 3, and was the background enemy designer for the first, has stated that the flesh lips' mouth is purposed as a reflection of Mary's, which was abusive to James with cruel words during her final days. It's likely that the lips on the bottom of the creature represent female genitalia, given the game's subliminal themes of sexual imagery. My final thought on the flesh lip is that the tangled mass of human limbs contained within may represent James's conflicting emotions regarding Mary. There isn't very much to say about the flesh lip combat-wise other than that I recommend the handgun for this fight for the mobility and its ease of use. Oh, and try not to get strangled by feet. Unless... The next adversary on our itinerary, that looks like it gives the most amazing blowjobs, by the way, is called the Mandarin. There are very few characteristics to the Mandarin, other than that they have small, sharp legs and relatively large arms that feature a pair of lips on either palm. The Mandarin evidently represents the feeling of overwhelming helplessness. These enemies are never engaged above ground, and are only encountered in areas with a mesh grating that they desperately cling to, afraid of falling into the abyssal nothingness below. They share a heavy similarity to James, as he's trying desperately not to give into his dark feelings of guilt and despair, which are represented by the abyss. The Mandarin's one and only attack is to lash James with a black tongue-like whip should he walk over them. These lashes could be interpreted as metaphorical, as they could represent the cries of his conscience, begging him to recall his murder of Mary. The next enemy that we encounter, or should I say, spiritual presence, isn't really an enemy at all. In all honesty, there isn't much to say regarding the inmates that inhabit the cold, forgotten cells of the Toluca prison. To be completely honest, I think that this enemy goes better unexplained, as I believe it complements the vague atmospherical ambiguity of Silent Hill. But for the sake of this video, I'll offer you my musings. They are likely to be remnants of the souls of prisoners of Toluca Lake. If you listen closely, they can be heard chanting the word in a haunting voice. This gives the implication that they were likely the victims of ritualistic sacrificial offerings carried out by the Order. They're likely representative of James holding himself prisoner of his guilt, a theme that's heavily present within the sequential area, the Labyrinth.
All I want from you is an answer.
Following the prisoners of Toluca Lake, the next creature of our feature procedure is known as the Abstract Daddy. And he's probably one of those assholes who owns a coffee mug with Father of the Year written on it. This abstract adversary is portrayed as two figures that appear to be engaged in sexual activity, entrapped in a flesh-like blanket that spans the width of its bed-frame-shaped rectangular body. This monstrosity is a manifestation of the sexual abuse and trauma inflicted upon Angela Roscoe when she was a child by her father Thomas and her unnamed brother. The head signifies her pain while the walls represent her womb. There are mechanical pistons discernible from the fleshy walls of the room, and are a portrayal of her view, apropos to the abuse that she suffered, an inescapable and mechanical experience. An interesting theme about the Abstract Daddy is in the matter of its name, as James doesn't perceive it as Angela does, due to it manifesting from her subconscious rather than his. James's perception of the Abstract Daddy is influenced by what minimal time he spent with Mary as she lay immobile in the hospital. The recollection of these memories leads to the Abstract Daddy reappearing after arriving at the Lakeview Hotel where he and Mary had previously stayed on vacation.
What letter?
Though they only appear once James meets Laura once again, and she passes on a letter from Mary that had gone unseen until now. Angela Orozco is seen for the final time later on in the hotel after James watches a videotape of him smothering Mary with a pillow where a cinematic plays and shows her ascending a stairway wreathed in scorching flames. There are 2 frames that decorate the walls of the stairway that display the castrated remains of her father Thomas and her unnamed brother, who she presumably emasculated and killed with the knife she loaned to James back in the Blue Creek apartments. She asks James to return the knife to her, but James refuses, as it's apparent that Angela has resigned herself to her suicide.
It's hot as hell in here.
As James swelters in the heat of the hallway, Angela expresses that it's always a fiery hell for her, and a disillusioned James watches reluctantly as Angela climbs the fiery stairway and eventually disappears into the burning abyss. Hey, you still awake? Okay, just checking. It's at this point that we really begin to go down the metaphorical rabbit hole with the addition of the big badass himself, Pyramid Head. Let's go. Pyramid Head is an 8-foot-tall, greatsword-wielding behemoth wearing a butcher's apron, surgical gloves, and a large pyramid-shaped object on his head for which he is eponymously named, with the object resembling the triangle which can be seen in the seal of Metatron seen here. The Seal of Metatron is often referred to throughout the Silent Hill series as the symbol of the ancient god, Samael. Pyramid Head is essentially a manifestation of James Sunderland's subconscious feeling of guilt, born from repressing the memory of murdering his late wife, Mary Shepard Sunderland. Pyramid Head is encountered frequently throughout the course of Silent Hill 2, and each encounter with him is a visual representation of something different. The first real encounter with Pyramid Head depicts him sexually assaulting some mannequins. If we're considering that the mannequins represent Mary and how vulnerable and defenseless she was, he's trying to remind James of his sexual advances towards Mary in her final days. The second encounter with Pyramid Head is a straight-up cage match in the Blue Creek apartment next door after James accidentally interrupts his happy time. After filling him with enough bullets, he seemingly submerges himself in the water of the stairwell. This is a visual metaphor depicting James's refusal and dismissal of what Pyramid Head desperately tried to convey to him earlier, and is also a metaphor of James subconsciously drowning in his guilt. There's a prevalent theme of water to Silent Hill 2, and it's pretty apparent if you pay close attention. The third encounter with Big Tall and Handsome takes place on the roof of Brookhaven Hospital, where he surprises James after he reads some passages from Mary's diary describing her days at the hospital. James didn't think that Pyramid Head's meat sword would be that big and thick, so he subsequently falls off the roof from shock. This scene depicts the subconscious feelings of anger and regret James felt after suffocating Mary. Encounter number 4 with Pyramid Head occurs when James and Maria are nearing the elevator in the basement of Brookhaven's Otherworld. They're chased through a winding maze of passages, and Maria is impaled with a spear by Pyramid Head. This encounter is designed to convey James's subconscious desperation for himself to acknowledge and accept the truth behind Mary's death, and it's also a metaphor for James's feeling of powerlessness being unable to help Mary in her time of suffering. The next rendezvous with Pyramid Head is in the flooded tunnels of the labyrinth deep below the Historical Society in the Toluca prison. This one is a little less cinematic, but it's still important, and will make sense in a second. The labyrinth's twisting and winding passages are a metaphorical representation of James trying to subconsciously cope and justify his actions. Depending upon your personal interpretation, this thought process is supported by the idea that when James's mental projection of Maria speaks to him through what appears to be the bars of a prison cell, that the concept of Mary is innocent, and conversely, James is the one behind bars, holding himself prisoner of the truth. The theme of guilt and innocence is built upon even further when James must solve a puzzle by distinguishing the wrongfully executed criminal amongst 5 other hanging corpses, and pull their corresponding noose in an adjacent room later on in the labyrinth. The final encounter with Pyramid Head takes place in the lobby of the Lakeview Hotel Otherworld. A scene plays where Pyramid Head is joined by a second that manifested when James killed Eddie Darbowski in self-defense. Maria can be seen dangling upside down from what appears to be a metal lattice, where she's impaled shortly after once more and James falls to his knees. Now knowing the truth behind Mary's death upon watching the VCR tape that he found in the Lakeview Hotel, James now finally understands what Pyramid Head is. A battle ensues shortly after where James forcibly subdues his feeling of guilt and revels in the glory of still being a murderer, I guess, and Pyramid Head is no more. The 2 Pyramid Heads commit a ritualistic suicide, symbolizing their acknowledgement of James's newfound knowledge, and bequeath 2 eggs, one rusted, and one vibrant and scarlet red in color. The symbolism of this battle represented the strength of James's will, with the eggs representing the strain and burden of refusing to accept the truth behind Mary's death, and the mental freedom of acceptance. Which brings us to the final rival in our register, Maria. Or at the very least, a horrifically warped manifestation of her, though it is possible for Mary to take her place, granted certain conditions are met. Maria takes the form of Mary's diseased corpse, which hangs upside down in a metal frame or lattice, comparable to the flesh lip, though this frame is outfitted with sharp, rusted spikes. Similar to the flesh lip, the frame most likely symbolizes Mary's hospitalization, with the spikes representing the pain and suffering she felt over the course of it. She appears to be outfitted with a sort of hood restricting the movement of her head, akin to the veil of a nun, most likely representing chastity due to her and James's forced celibacy. Maria has a number of attacks that she can use against James. The most common of these attacks being a long, black tendril that emerges from her hood that she can use to asphyxiate James, though she has the ability to use it as a whip to lash him, provided he's within range. Maria's final attack is the conjuring of a large swarm of ravenous, flesh-eating black moths that surround James and impair his movement for a short time. While the symbolism of the strangulation attack is a little self-evident, the symbolism of the moths is a little more convoluted, so allow me to elaborate. The moth is perceived to be symbolic of decay, such as a crow is a symbol of omens, and is perceived as a sign of death. In contrast to the symbolism of the moth, Maria bears a tattoo of a butterfly on her stomach, which is believed to be a symbol of rebirth and good health. Thank you for watching this video. If you've been following my Silent Hill 2 series, I hope you enjoyed it, or if you happened upon this video at random, feel free to check it out. Lastly, if you enjoyed the series in my deep, sexy voice, please consider dropping me a follow on Twitch at the annotation provided above, where I play a variety of incredible games, incredibly poorly. This has been Serenity Miyazaki, and I hope to see you soon.